You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you till you take my sunshine away. The other night, dear, while I was sleeping, I dreamt I held you in my arms. When I awoke, dear, I was mistaken. So I held my head and I cried, you are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you till you take my sunshine away. That was a song that my father sang to me every night when I was a little boy to help me go to sleep, because I was afraid of the dark. A half a century later, I am sitting in a chair at the Hôpital des Aveugles in Lausanne, and the ophthalmologist is looking through a contraption at my eye, and through the eye is examining my optic nerve. And I can hear an audible gasp. He then pulls away the machine and says, Mr. Bailey, you have lost 95% of the mass of your optic nerve. Your ocular pressure is through the roof and has probably been that way for some time. If there is no intervention, you will be completely blind within the year. And I said, well, what can be done? How can you fix it? And he said, there is no way of fixing it. There is no surgery that can be done. The optic nerve cannot be regenerated under the current science. All we can do is apply medication of beta blockers, of which there are 4 regimens. We will use them one at a time, but understand that your body is going to build up resistance to it. And at a certain point, the blindness could become inevitable. So what can we do? Well, you can learn how to use adaptive technology. The white cane, the tinted glasses to reduce the glare. And I thought, no, I mean, that's not me. I mean, what are you going to do? Give me a tin cup with pencils in it? I mean, no. And he said, what's that on your forehead? I said, what do you mean? He said, on your forehead, there are these bruises, like a string of Christmas tree lights. Oh, well, this red one was when I bumped into an open cabinet door in the kitchen. And this green one was when I fell down the stairs. And this red one was when I tried to plug in an electrical plug into the outlet and hit my head against the wall. And this purple one was when I ran into a lamppost. And he said, you have to use the cane. He also explained that over time, the neuroplasticity in my brain would begin to kick in, that the visual cortex represents 1/5 of the brain's capacity, and that as it receives less and less information from the optic nerve, new neural pathways will begin to build to the auditory senses. And I will slowly begin to use that computer power with oral information rather than visual information, and my perception of the world will change. But in the meantime, you have to learn to cope. What he didn't explain to me was that because 1/5 of the brain's capacity is this computing of visual information, that in our contemporary society, 80% of the way we engage the world is visual. So when you lose that, it's like a kind of a death. I felt exiled, cast out. And like a death, I went through all the different phases. There were days when I was angry, why me? And there were days when I felt incredible grief and sorrow for what I had lost. The fact that I might not be able to recognize my son's face again. And in fact, I have not been able to recognize faces for about 3 years. And then other days when I went into denial. Well, what if they're wrong? What if I'm just tired? And even bargaining. I read on the internet that maybe if you ate more fruit, your vision might come back. And like a death, you eventually reach acceptance. But unlike death, there's another phase, what I would call transcendence. But in the meantime, I had to learn to cope. And some of it I had to do by myself, and it came up in surprising ways. Like, for instance, I'd be at the office and pouring myself a glass of water at the water cooler, and the person next to me would stop chatting with a friend of his and look at me surprised and said, "How did you do that?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, you filled up that glass of water without looking at it. You filled it to the top without spilling." But then I realized, oh my God, I did. Have you ever noticed that when you fill a container of water, the Doppler effect kicks in and the pitch rises? I had intuitively learned the pitch of a full glass of water. My trainer would take me into the streets of Lausanne at night and would teach me how to travel safely in traffic. And what she would do is she would have me on the sidewalk and she'd say, "Okay, we're going to blindfold you and you're going to walk on the sidewalk without walking into the traffic." And I would try it and she would stop me because I was getting too close to the curb. And okay, try again. But this time I want you to hear the noise of the traffic like a line. And hear that Doppler effect so that you can imagine that sound as an arrow. And I want you to walk parallel to that line. So I thought, okay, I'll try that. And I imagined the line and I tried to walk parallel to it, and I ended up running into the building. And she said, that's perfectly normal because it's not parallel the way you imagine it. In a painting in three-point perspective, if you have a road going up to the horizon line, it's actually a triangle hitting a vanishing point. And in that painting, it's an actual physical ending point, a dot. But it represents symbolically in our mind two parallel lines going on for infinity. It's a contradiction. Sound is the same way. In order to be safe, I can't walk parallel to that line because I'm actually going to move away from it. I have to walk to that vanishing point that is created by that sound. And so when I tried it, my whole body resisted because it felt like I was moving into danger. It felt like I was moving into traffic. And I had to put that physical fear out of my mind and trust that if I concentrate just on moving to that vanishing point, I'm going to be safe, even though every fiber in my body was telling me that I was walking to my doom. But I learned. The next part of the journey was an experience with my father-in-law who had severe Alzheimer's. He had been a pianist his entire life, and in this state, he was in a constant state of anxiety. He had lost all conception of time. It was a little bit like waking up from a constant dream. And the expression on his face was one of agony all the time, just time flitting through his fingers. He had forgotten that he was a musician. He'd forgotten what a piano was. And yet when we sat him down on the bench and put his hands on the keyboard, the muscle memory would kick in and he would begin to play. Not perfectly, but he would play. But what was remarkable about that wasn't just the fact that he was playing, but the expression on his face transformed into peace. The anxiety disappeared. And I began to think about that. Why? And for me, the clue came with some writings from Jean-Philippe Rameau, where as a Baroque composer, he played the harpsichord, so it wasn't chords. He had to play the individual notes. And he theorized intuitively that for him, the experience of listening to music was you had a memory of the note that was just played, you had the experience of the note currently being played, and you had the anticipation of the next note, and together in your mind it already forms a chord. And what we know from the neurology is that anticipation of that last chord, you get a shot of dopamine, and then when that last note is played and it's different from what you had anticipated, but beautiful, you get rewarded with a shot of serotonin, that awe. And what I began to realize was that the act of listening and playing music was actually a form of healing broken time. Our conception of time in our brain, our conception of past and future is part of the same space in our brain. And by taking our experience of time and artificially turning it into a linear concept, which is what we do, it gives us a tremendous evolutionary advantage, because from our conception of the past, we can learn, and from our conception of the future, we can plan. But it comes at a terrible cost, because with that conception of the past comes a sense of fearful loss. And with that conception of the future comes terrible dread. And most of human suffering is from that sense of loss and dread. And there's something about music that repairs that. That in our society, more and more, we're not living in the present moment. We're living in the past. We're living in the future. And music makes it whole again. So my transformation happened before the pandemic. I was in Washington for a meeting, and I had heard that there was going to be a performance of Mozart's Requiem at the National Cathedral. And it's one of my favorite pieces of music. And I'm sitting down and I'm listening to this beautiful music that so intuitively mirrors all the stages of grief that I had described earlier. But something happened during that performance, where rather than just listening to the voices and the words and the sound and the tempo and the pitch and the dynamics, I began to experience that sound moving through the matter around me. And the sound, through that sound, I could feel the architecture of the cathedral. I could feel the difference of the texture of the sound passing through flesh and clothing or cold stone. I experienced an awakening to a world of sound. And what I realized was that sound was more immediate and more palpable than the visual world. Because when you think about it, what is vision? Vision is light reflecting off of the surface of things. But sound is energy that passes through matter. So rather than feeling disconnected and exiled, I actually felt a deeper, more immediate connection with the world and with the people around me. Just as you willingly close your eyes to better savor a glass of red wine, just as you willingly close your eyes to better embody a beautiful piece of music, just as you willingly close your eyes to trace the gentle slope of a lover's forearm, so too do I accept the closing of my eyes to better savor this moment with you. And as for me, the medication is no longer working. Blindness is now inevitable. But because of my transformation, as I walk to that vanishing point, I do so without fear, without dread. And should I falter, I know I'm going to hear the voice of my Father singing to me, comforting me as I journey into the darkness, vast and immeasurable. Thank you.
Take a seat.
Oh.
So that gets us into our last panel, of which Christopher Bailey is a part. And joining him is Joy Allen, who is the chair of music therapy at the Berklee School of Music and the director of the Music and Health Institute. And Susan Mag-Salmon, who's the executive director of the International Arts and Mind Lab at Johns Hopkins and the co-director of the Neuro Arts Blueprint. So we put this panel together because we felt that each of you had something to say about the larger vision here. So either beyond
So to speak.
music. I'm sorry. Correct.
That's cruel. I shouldn't say things like that.
Let me try that again. We're here to look beyond the...
Look, it's a biased language, right?
It is. Yeah, this is very informative. So I'm just going to say...
I hear you.
Great. That I'm hoping we can speak to the role that music and other arts and other ways of well-being might have in terms of our mental health, and how we can work together across disciplines for this same purpose, which is essentially to help a society that is in dire trouble when it comes to mental health and well-being. So Susan, may I start with you and ask you to tell us a little bit about the Neuro Arts Blueprint for people who are not familiar, as this is an initiative that has just blossomed, especially most recently, so tell us a little bit about it.
Sure, I'd be happy to. First of all, I met Christopher several years ago, and so we've been palling around, and he's a charmer, as I think you got it, and he said, "You are so beautiful." And I realized that he lost his ability to see faces 3 years ago. So I have a bone to pick with you.
You smelled beautiful.
Yeah, right, exactly. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Mm-hmm. So the Neuro Arts Blueprint. I'm really excited to be here, first of all, and I want to thank all of the organizers. This is one of my first outings, so it's really wonderful to be with so many colleagues and friends and to talk about something that's so vitally important. So about 4 years ago, my lab at Johns Hopkins, we were asked by the president of the university to look at this stuff called neuroaesthetics. He really wanted to understand what people were talking about, and was there really signal around all the noise about the neurobiology of the arts, and what did that really mean, and was there something there for us? In 2008, we had a symposium called The Science of the Arts, and we invited several scientists in different areas, mostly around sensory systems, and also artists to come and talk about the intersection of the arts and sciences. And based on that, our lab, through the Brain Science Institute, funded several researchers, all that did brilliant work, including funding some of the work that Charles did on creativity. And what was remarkable is that there was no secondary funding. There was great data, great information, but it was really clear that there was not an appetite in the United States to fund more neuroscience or neurology or brain sciences around the arts. And so a couple years go by, and our president says, I think there's something here. I really think there's something here. So we started to talk to people in different fields. So we talked to art therapists, rehabilitation folks, psychologists, psychiatrists, in all the art forms. And what we heard was that in public health, in medicine, in psychiatry, that there was great interest, tremendous interest across the world in this, but there were a lot of silos, there were a lot of barriers, there was a lack of sustainable, consistent funding as it related to research. So it was everywhere, and in some ways it was nowhere. So I was invited to meet with the folks down at Aspen Institute to talk about this issue of is it possible to bring this very diverse community together, all the different art forms across diseases and disorders, across all the different types of issues in society? Is that even a thing? And the Aspen Institute said, we're game, let's give it a try. So we spent the last 2.5 years talking to people in all of the different areas I mentioned, all over the world, and forged a document together with all of these communities called the Neuro Arts Blueprint, which is basically a 6-year plan now to make arts and health and neuroaesthetics, neuro arts a thing. So the North Star is to be able to make the arts mainstream in medicine and public health. And that's a really audacious goal, and it's a big idea, but it's something that has long been overdue, and it's something that we're really excited about to steward and help work through with all of you and many more. So right now there is, we released the blueprint in December last year. January, February, we worked to put together a very comprehensive implementation plan, and there's really 3 parts. One is looking at building infrastructure, and that means infrastructure of the field, so creating a kind of an Uber resource network where whether you're a practitioner, an artist, a researcher, a policymaker, a funder, we can find each other, which is really, really hard to do right now, and we can figure out how to talk to each other. The second part is building community. And that's so that we get to know each other, and we have ability to be able to know where we are, what we're doing, how we're doing it, and there's a number of steps in each of these. And then the third area is really building evidence, and that's basic science, that's clinical research outcomes, that's looking at outcome measures in the community, and it's also looking at evidence like economic analyses, and Barbara, I think, spoke to that today. It's so important to look at all these different types of evidence, so that there's a chain of activities around that. And if you go to neuroartsblueprint.org, you can find all this information, and there'll be more along the way. There's a webinar coming up next week with AARP, and if I get a chance, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the goal is to build evidence so that we can have policy, and we're doing some really interesting things in understanding that crazy sort of what is policy and how does policy get made, because it's really fascinating, and I think there's a real opportunity to be able to make changes there rapidly, and so have some short-term wins, some mid-range wins, and some long-term wins.
And Chris, you were at the WHO for many years before you became the Arts and Health lead, and so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the inception of the Arts and Health arm and how you took on that leadership role.
Well, sure. Yeah, I've been at WHO for 20 years, and for the first decade or so, I actually started the health informatics program at WHO. And what I found was I was primarily working in HIV clinics in rural Africa and using data and data systems to improve quality of care. But the best way of actually engaging that clinical community was actually through the arts. I used Augusto Boal's forum theater techniques to try and create a narrative together rather than coming in as an expert from Geneva with prepackaged solutions, right? And it worked tremendously well. The result was this open source system called OpenMRS, which is now in every country of the world, has millions of patients in the system. So there was using the arts techniques of theater, song, as part of my technical work, but then also on evenings and weekends I was running a theater company and trying to slip in development and human rights issues against the wishes of some of the older expats there. And when Dr. Tedros came on board as Director General, he put out this famous call to staff for crazy ideas. And my crazy idea was to combine the two and to sort of come out of my artistic closet and say, I'd like to start an arts and health program. And my argument was pretty simple. I got my 15 minutes to make the pitch, and I said, we know that data, evidence, and information are essential for identifying objective scientific truth, for problem solving, for saving lives. But we also know from the evidence that data, evidence, and information are often insufficient to change people's deeply held convictions and behavior. For that, we need empathy, often in the form of a narrative. And he agreed, and that was the starting point.
So with that in mind too, I mean, I think we've spent a lot of time today talking about music therapy in particular in terms of a music intervention for mental health and well-being. If we had a day two, we'd probably explore some of the other kinds of music-based interventions that are not necessarily run by or used by music therapists that have been used in particular for serious mental illnesses. And we sort of have seen an explosion of work in that area. And so I wondered, Joy Allen, if you could talk a little bit about the Music and Health Initiative, where you see sort of music therapy in this space of the larger picture of the effect that music can have on mental health and well-being.
Sure. I think now we have it. So within the Music and Health Institute, which we started at Berkeley in 2018 through generous grant through the Barr Foundation, is that we came in with the belief that health is a continuum from wellness to disease management, right? But music is a continuum, and the expertise along that is as well. So from everyday user, every one of us are musical beings with our heartbeat. I think it's going up. There we go. So looking on that continuum of expertise within music that starts with the consumer, who's the expert, to the musician, to the healthcare provider, to the caregiver, to the physician, and up to the music therapist, and saying, okay, we're never going to have enough music therapists. We won't. And do we necessarily need music therapists for everything? Or do we need to help people realize how to reconnect with their musical selves, going back to that heartbeat, right? And so within the Music and Health Institute, we're looking at in a couple of different ways. We're not doing the research. We're helping people find the research, and we're helping them not only find that research, but then make it transactional. What does it mean for your everyday issue that you're working on? So within, one of the things we did was, or we started doing, is building a repository, and it's called the Remix, Music and Health Remix. And the thing that I think was most pivotal within that was trying to build a shared language of interventions within the music and health space. Because if you look at a lot of the research, people like to use active or passive. That's how they define a music intervention. The challenge with that is music listening doesn't necessarily mean passive, nor does it really capture the number of interventions that people use on an everyday basis. So we built a music and health taxonomy. And again, it's not perfect, but it's a starting place. To put a shared language so that people can find interventions, find what it really means, but it can also help categorize things for when we are looking at an evidence base. And so you'll see in there the way that we develop within the interventions. We have receptive, but under receptive is things like song communication, song discussion, music and imagery. Rhythmic auditory stimulation, those are receptive methods. Creative methods, improvisational methods, and recreative experiences, but they're all listed there. But then we started pulling the research, because if you're a researcher, you obviously know how to use databases, right? You know how to find it. If you're a physician, you're probably gonna go to medical journals first. Behavioral health, you're gonna go to behavioral health journals. Music therapy, you might go to all of them. If you're a caregiver, you might not even know where to go. If you're an entrepreneur, you may or may not know where to go. So we started putting these in open access within this taxonomy. So we built the repository. The first one was on music and pain, because that's one of the #1 health initiatives. So within that, you can go just Google Berkeley Music and Health Institute and go under research collection. And you can go in there and see the taxonomy, and you can put things in like adolescent in the pain, and you can put in adolescent songwriting. You could put in sickle cell. But it's going to show and pull all the literature that's out there with those particular parameters. You could do older adults songwriting in pain and see what's up there. You can do many other different things within that. Now we just released mental health and substance disorders, and dementia is going to be released this fall. So what we wanted to do with that is we like to talk evidence-based, but that's great within the research and health community, but if you don't know what that means, this helps you find that information. And the key to that is it helps with our funders, it helps with our community leaders, it helps experts to see that information and where to find it. The other thing that we did within that remix is now we're trying to start adding case studies with that so that you can see what that means in action. I don't know why it's going on now.
It might be running low on batteries.
Sorry. Can I switch for a second? So it makes it a little bit more accessible, because the other big thing that I think when we're talking about moving things forward is we have to start thinking about innovation and working collaboratively. So when we talk about teams, a lot of times we're just talking healthcare teams, build your healthcare teams. We have to start thinking about teams of musicians, music therapists, entrepreneurs, technology savvy, experts within different areas, so that when we say, here's the challenge, that we're having that diverse thought, but that we're making it whatever things that we're putting forward for change that actually impact the person that we're thinking about. Because many times, again, it's that transactional nature. This is what the research says, but what does that look like in an everyday person's life on how they can use that, and how do we make it accessible for them? And that's what we're trying to do.
We have our own initiative to create an infographic in collaboration with the AMTA. I think it's on slide 4 in this deck. Can we see if it's there? I think I remember that correctly as an example of that kind of a collaboration. Let's see. Yes, so that's what we're newly released, and I think that this is coming to some of the issues that you raised in terms of where do people get information. That's also a need that you know, we've been working to solve, and I agree that collaboration, we also have a clearinghouse. We should really collaborate with you to disseminate, you know, those two resources, because, you know, I think that there is a real need there.
Absolutely. I was going to say the only other thing that we're trying to do a lot, because community in the mental health is something we're all very passionate about. But then going back to that transactional approach, when we know that, for example, I'll use playlist as an example. We like to say, here's a playlist, go on Spotify, pick your playlist. But what if we just had a workshop that said, here, build your own playlist? Because sometimes we need someone to sit with us, but we could do it in masses and say, hey, here's your opportunity, here's point A, here's point B. Start here, go to here, using our ISO principle, but helping people develop that skill. It doesn't take a rocket scientist, it doesn't take a lot of time, but it gives them the agency and the skill, and we're building a toolbox, and that's what we should be focused in on with. We know this data, now let's start building toolboxes for people to use in their everyday lives.
But I think there's also going to be a lot of immersive technologies that are coming online, virtual reality and so forth, and there will be, of course, a lot of data collected from people that then, these tech companies can use to help people get to those things without it having to be explicit.
Absolutely, and we have the honor to work with a lot of tech companies, and Susan's wonderful impact thinking framework, which we use. We're building a music and health innovation studio, and we're actually in a 2-week pilot of it right now. And the wonderful thing about it is just like what you said. It's, a lot of times our tech companies, they want to make a difference. They want to help make things accessible in a way that is meaningful, but it's that transactional part. Here's what the science says. Okay, it says to play at this beat, but that's not translating it into everyday life. And then when we work together collaboratively and we can take that and throw out those challenges, musicians are creatives. Throw the challenges to them. Like right now, we have 33 students working on a project of developing healthier ways to take breaks instead of using substances. And using the impact thinking framework out of Hopkins, they're going through that process. These are composers, electronic production and music engineers. There's a few music therapy students in there, but they're learning a way to think for health outcomes, and that's important.
So I was going to ask an annoying question, and I was going to preface it with paint us a picture, but now I will not do that. Instead, I'm going to ask you to give us a soundscape and we'll start with you, Chris, of if everything that you hope for comes true 10 years from now, can you give us an example of what success would look like, say, for an individual? Is there a case study out in the future 10 years from now that you could tell us about that would mean that we've been successful?
Well, I'll answer that question twice.
Great.
The first answer is for individuals, what I see happening is a democratization of the arts that I think part of the problem is, and it's why there's this taint of elitism to a lot of the arts. It's because it, over the years, has become commodified. And so the way we consume the arts is through experts, it's through celebrities, it's through, false perfections. And we forget, for instance, like the Steinway piano is associated with concert halls, right? But what made the Steinway piano in the 19th century brilliant was that it was like a television. They made it cheaply on the assembly line so that every family could have one and play their own music. And sheet music was produced to tell topical stories. It was like the internet. It was a totally different way of consuming music. And I think we need to go back to that. So there's that aspect. But then from a WHO point of view, our arts and health program, we're already in the process of building this network of collaborating centers around the world to build up the evidence base, but for a specific purpose. I've negotiated a cooperative agreement with UNESCO, and our idea is in a few years to take that evidence, synthesize it into policy recommendations, and hold the very first meeting of all the ministers of culture and ministers of health in the same room to present it and ideally trigger a massive global investment in the arts for the specific purpose of improving community health. That's the vision. Well.
Whoops. I'll do two. So big idea. I think that, well, let me start with the first. Let's see. Okay, I'll start with the big one. So right now we spend every year $3 billion on Alzheimer's research to understand how the brain, what's happening in the brain. And that's really important because Alzheimer's and dementia is really just devastating. We spend very little money on research for the arts related to healthcare or mental health. So my vision is that we would have a multi-billion-dollar budget to really be able to think about the arts, and I'm thinking all the arts in terms of interventions across diseases and disorders and mental health. So that's a big idea in the United States. And I think we see that actually in other countries where countries are spending money in their healthcare to think about how to integrate the arts. They could do more, but it's happening in other countries much more than it is in the United States. And then the second idea is that on an individual level, we have something that I call aesthetic mindset, which is that from the time our kids are little, they're learning about how the brain works, and they're learning how our sensory systems are working, and how sound and smell and taste and touch all affect us, and they're using it in their daily lives. So they maybe get up to the smell of something that they prefer because the default mode network is engaged. They're singing in the shower, and they may not sing well, but they sing in the shower because it makes them feel better, right? They're eating something that smells delicious, and so their aesthetic mindset starts young and it moves all the way through our lifespan. So we're healthier, and I'll say we're happier and we're more joyful. So it's not just about not feeling well, it's about feeling well and being able to contribute. So that's this idea of an aesthetic mindset for all of us, I think, is something that's really important.
Can I add to that a little bit? Because I think that's beautiful. And I also think on a much more simple level, what do the arts fundamentally do? At the simplest level, they allow us to refine the lost art of deep listening and deep observation. Wouldn't it be wonderful if in a few years we stopped speaking over each other and constantly trying to prove the other person's wrong because their different worldview is a threat to my fragile mental model, but to actually start listening to each other and observing each other and finding a story together? I mean, that would be a revolution of the heart, and that's what we need.
It's so funny because I always tell our students our job as music therapists is to help the individual tell their story.
Yeah.
And the music allows them to do that. And I would think we were successful if we get to the point that we realize music allows us to reconnect with ourselves, which allows us to reconnect with others. And it's that connection with others that is so needed in terms of addressing mental health and well-being. But then asking the question, so many times we get the question as musicians or music therapists or consumers of music is, what song should I play or what should I do? But get to the question of what do I need from the music today? And this is how I'm going to get that.
Yeah.
And it's just a little tweak in the language, right? But it makes a big difference. What do I need from the music? Do I need it to reconnect with a loved one? Do I need it to express a feeling? Do I need it to help me calm down or focus, whatever it is? But then have those tools available and helpful for you to be there.
Well, I'll give a concrete example. Earlier this year, I was approached by a group to help with a program of documenting the cultural preservation of Yazidi culture in northern Iraq, which was on the verge of being lost, right? And the idea was to hire professional photographers and anthropologists and to go in and document these things, and they wanted WHO to be involved. And I said, when I looked at the plan, I said, absolutely not. You don't need a photographer. You need to teach them to use a camera and let them choose what should be documented and tell their own story. And the result was some amazing discoveries. Like part of the cultural tradition for the Yazidi women was these beautiful tattoos, right? And under occupation by ISIS, where they photographed, as part of this project, how they adapted that tattooing technique to tattoo stylized versions of their names onto their skin because they weren't allowed to either hear or speak their names out loud while they were in sexual slavery. And they were terrified that they would be killed and discarded and nobody would know who they were. And so that's why they tattooed. And that was something that only they could tell, right? And to me, it goes back to the essence of the therapeutic value of the arts and this quote from Carl Jung, which is kind of my touchstone, where he said, loneliness is not the absence of people. Loneliness is the inability to express what matters to you most. And Susan said something to me this morning, which I think speaks to it. It's this difference between a medicalized view and a well-being view, or a deficit-based approach and an asset-based approach. A doctor will ask a patient, "What's the matter with you?" An artist will ask the patient, "What matters to you?" And that's the difference.
So as we near the end of the day, I'm happy to open it up for questions to our panel, but I'm also happy to hear your thoughts and reactions, because of course not all of you had the microphone today, and we of course invited you because we want to hear what you have to say. So please feel free to tell us some of your reactions, some of your concerns, some of your inspirational ideas of where we are, and or ask a question of the panel. Have we talked ourselves out? Yeah, Matt.
Well, it's not inspirational. It's about joy about the repository Berkeley and your center. And is it simply providing citations, or it's summarizing the data from these studies? And so that's the question. And how often is it updated?
So it's updated. The collections that are up there right now, the pain, mental health, substance use and abuse disorder, they're updated every 6 months. The new ones we're trying to get out every 9 months to a year, because it takes a lot of time to pull all of the information and categorize it within that taxonomy. It's a process. There are short abstracts that are being provided for them, and as much as we can provide open access articles, we're also doing that as well. We're trying to get to the point, and it's a matter of, it's a big undertaking that we can link, like I said, the case studies, but then we also, dreamland, 10, 15 down the years, want to build, landing pages where people have access to tools that they can use. It's taking that transactional approach to things and saying, okay, what does this all mean in an everyday life that I could automatically implement, assuming that you're at this level of care, not at the higher acuity of care where we want more individualized or group music therapy services. Did that help answer your question? Okay.
Yep.
This was brought up earlier in the day and it kind of got passed over. I'm a philanthropist and my husband and I support music therapy at a hospital. What's going to be done about funding for music therapy, because it is not reimbursed by insurance at this time, and it is badly needed, and it's badly needed by people that don't have the funds to pay for it. So what are some of the thoughts and ideas of what we're going to do to keep the funding going?
I can give you a specific example of something that we've been working on. So I mentioned Alzheimer's earlier. So last year we did a economic analysis for Alzheimer's and music, both individual and group music. And what we found was that there is a 3-to-1 return on the investment. So it costs $1 compared to $3 currently being expended on Alzheimer's treatments, whether that's caregivers or pharmacological interventions, et cetera. But what we found also was that the research on the intervention of music is very broad and very thin. And so the CMS does not look at this, so Medicare or Medicaid does not fund it. So now what we're doing, working with Hopkins and a number of other researchers, is a pilot study looking at music as an intervention that's been discussed with the CMS that will ultimately reach an agreed upon threshold of what music has to do in order to be reimbursed. So if we can get reimbursement for just music and Alzheimer's, that's a start, right? And we know that if the CMS does it, private funders or private healthcare providers will follow. So we're gonna start with Alzheimer's, and then we're moving on to some other different diseases and disorders. And I think we need some really tangible results to show interventions and neurobiology that we can meet these thresholds that aren't arbitrary but that are agreed upon. And I think there's a lot of research, but it doesn't necessarily, the dots don't connect. And so that's an example of something that an approach that I think will help us get to ultimately reimbursement and larger pools of funds that will allow us to bring in music therapists in this case, but ultimately creative arts therapists and other, rehabilitation, psychology, et cetera.
Yeah, another example is from our 2019 WHO report on the evidence base for the health benefits of the arts, where one of the studies covered in that was about physical rehabilitation, right? And what it showed through an actual trial with a control was that patients who were recovering from surgery or some kind of physical injury would go through the same kind of physical rehabilitation, the same movements at the same rate, but with one group, it was set to music. And what they found is that with the group where the physical rehabilitation was set to music, it reduced the hospital stay by 50%. And that's a number that insurance companies are going to be interested in.
And I just, not to be the Debbie Downer here, but at the other end too, particularly when we're talking about mental health and well-being, is that the funding for mental health services in general is non-existent in many areas, particularly within communities where it is needed the most. And that's something that we have to pay more attention to, not just for funding within the arts, but mental health in general.
And there's a pipeline issue there too.
Oh, huge pipeline issue, huge pipeline issue.
And diversity.
Show a cost savings of reduced dependency on pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceutical companies won't be happy, but the
Well, and
insurance companies.
recidivism rates and homelessness and many other things too.
There's another study that was done recently looking at adherence to medication and music. So, this isn't two things can be true, right? You can have medication and the arts. And so I think this isn't like who wins.
We often do.
Well, and right, but it's not who wins, but how we collaborate. And I think if artists are the best collaborators, so I think it's possible to make this happen because we do collaborate. We want to collaborate.
And there are people like Renee Fleming who are working very hard to change policy, to talk to leadership, and that's really a goal, I think, here too. So just behind me now is the last survey that we're going to ask you to fill out. If this QR code doesn't work, you should have it in your email soon. It should be sent to you. So please feel free to fill that out. I'll just give you a second to capture the QR code.
The insurance issue, I think, is I'm super cynical about it because of what I've experienced in the hospital. I mean, we all know that hearing aids work. That doesn't require a lot of evidence, yet that's not covered by insurance.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not somebody who believes that insurance companies have our same agenda or even
Yeah.
actually care about the quality of evidence that we're producing. In fact, sometimes I think it's the opposite. They're going to ignore whatever evidence that we present. And so this is the thing that kind of tortures me at night about a lot of the patient things that we come up with is that all of the good intentions and all of the sort of care and effort, the genuine belief that these interventions are going to be useful, the access to them is going to be almost impossible for the majority of patients that need it. And so I think we have a long way to go. And
Well,
actually, I think we need to partner with philanthropists to raise, I think, enough awareness that there's some sort of like snowball momentum where there's a groundswell of more grassroots support that this idea is important. But I can't tell you that I feel optimistic about it. I think we're here like fighting an uphill battle, knowing that it's an uphill battle. On the other hand, having some conviction that it's the right battle.
Well, and I think I agree with you, and I think we need some kind of teamwork, some collaboration, because as a philanthropist, my husband and I started a pilot, and it was going great. We were funding yearly, and then we realized if we died, the program was going to die because there was going to be no funding for it. So we endowed it, and then we had an event to tell people about it, hoping more people would jump in, and they did not. And so it's who do we work with? Do we work with policymakers? Do we work with universities? Do we work with healthcare? Do we need them all at a convening like this to say this is what needs to be done? It is a non-pharmaceutical way of
So the answer is yes, because evidence is necessary but not sufficient. So you have to have an advocacy strategy, and whether that's through policymakers or advocacy groups or all of the above, absolutely.
I think philanthropy, our philanthropists at Hopkins feel the same way you do, is that they're funding as much as they can, but they know it's not enough. And if you're a healthcare funder, an arts funder, or a science funder, you may not know each other, but we need you to come together. And so even bringing the funders together, I think a lot of times institutions are like, well, I don't want my funder to be in but we need to share. We have to share, because without that, you're concerned because you know that your money's only going to go so far. Our donor feels the same way, but when they get together with other donors, they start to figure out, let's think about this in other ways that we never would have thought of by ourselves. So
it's almost like forming teams, like when we have teams of researchers, it's the teams of the funders. And I will say, we've had success at Berkeley when we run exchanges, what we call our convenings. And we invite policymakers, insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, our philanthropists, our musicians, researchers. And when they're at a table together, it's really interesting to see. I was just telling Susan, pharmaceutical company, this was one on pain, and I play wedding planner, so there's a mixed people at a table to put forth agendas. And insurance company says to pharmaceutical company, that's great that you're doing that, but that's not the outcome measure I need to fund. And it was like, wait a minute. We're doing all of this thinking through our lens, but we never had the conversation to say, okay, how do we work together to get the evidence that we need to fund? And that's just a simple example of the conversations that do need to happen in so many ways.
Kimberly?
And if I can speak to another piece of this, another hat I wear is involved in this policy and advocacy world here in the U.S., but more at the state level. When Jennifer and Barb were up talking about AOTA, they mentioned that we have 15 states now with some sort of formal state recognition. So in terms of our strategy as a profession, that's another piece that we've looked at, and we have seen, and just the end of this is quite small, but there have been examples where having a state license or a state registry has opened access to state funding streams that weren't previously accessible. So this is a multi-pronged strategy. There are lots of pieces in the private sector, in terms of public policy sector as well.
Can we have the first slide up again, please? So I think we have to wrap because we still have a dinner to go to, which hopefully your appetites are growing. But cocktail hour to start. But before we do, I do want to thank just a few people, including our sponsors, who I won't name again, but whose logos are up here. But there are 4 other people that have yet to be mentioned that I think is really important for us to mention. Our website, including the one for this convening, would not be possible without Papong Jaradavong. Disseminating this information with her prescient ability to predict even Kendrick Lamar being in the conversation over a week ago is our social media guru, Sherimal Edwards. Karen Barrett-Chan could not be with us today, but she is instrumental in all of the research work that we do, including our clearinghouse and all of the other ways in which we disseminate our research evidence. And this convening could absolutely not have happened without the tireless energy and work and multitasking mind of Stephanie Purnell. So thank you, Stephanie.